and welcome to the Alabama Renaissance Faire channel. Today, stay tuned as we welcome Lee Freeman, author of Medieval Speake, an in-depth encyclopedia of the Renaissance period. Hello and welcome to the Alabama Renaissance Faire channel. Today we have a guest, Lee Freeman, and today we're going to talk about his book that he wrote, and I've prepared a few questions. How you doing today?
Doing good. Good to be here again.
Alrighty. The first question is, why did you write the book on the Dark Ages? But before you answer that, what was the Dark Ages?
One reason I wrote the book was to settle that issue. The period that we're talking about, the period that in which the Alabama Renaissance Faire is set, is the medieval period, which was a period of roughly 410 AD to circa 1500 AD. It used to be called the Dark Ages, but historians haven't used the term Dark Ages to describe the period in about 75 or 80 years. Now the term Dark Ages is only used to describe the early medieval period from roughly 410 AD to roughly 1000 AD, and they only use the term Dark Ages because it describes the lack of written historical sources. We have a lot more archaeological sources, a lot more archaeological artifacts than we do actual written sources, so they call it the Dark Ages for that reason. So that's why they call it the Dark Ages for that early period. The medieval period was roughly 410 AD to roughly 1500 AD.
So when was the Renaissance period?
That's another good question.
The years.
The Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, more properly, began during the Middle Ages, around 1330 in Florence, Italy, and ended sometime around 1530. Of course, precise dating of any historical era, even the medieval Renaissance period, is kind of tricky because history in real life is not always as neat and tidy. Historians just use those descriptors to help them do their job as kind of academic shorthand. So it's not like somebody in 1329 said, hey guys, tomorrow the Renaissance starts. That's just a convenient way of talking about it. The Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance period, began circa 1330 in Florence, Italy. It was actually intellectuals in the Renaissance period, like Petrarch, the poet and author, who are largely responsible for starting this myth conception that the Middle Ages was, 1,000 years of intellectual stagnation, barbarism, superstition, because Petrarch and the guys that were writing and studying in the Renaissance period sort of were they were sort of intellectual snobs, if you will. They thought that everything that went before them wasn't anything. They were the guys that were really cooking. So they came up with the term Middle Ages, in Latin medium aevum, to describe the medieval period, which in their minds was 1,000 years when nothing really exciting happened. But now we're in the Italian Renaissance period, 1330s, now we're cooking. So in this myth, has caught on. I see a lot more continuity between the Italian Renaissance periods and the medieval periods. I agree with the famous medieval professor of literature, professor of medieval and Renaissance literature, C.S. Lewis, who taught at Oxford and then Cambridge. And C.S. Lewis, who wrote several books on medieval Renaissance literature, said that the Renaissance can hardly be described nowadays as anything except whatever the speaker happens to like from the late Middle Ages. And I agree with that. A lot of the intellectual pursuits that interested Renaissance thinkers had also, interested medieval thinkers. But, these myths sort of took shape, beginning with Petrarch and those guys and continuing on through Edward Gibbon and some of the Voltaire in the 18th and 19th centuries. So there actually were 3 rebirths or renaissances. Renaissance is the French word for rebirth. 3 periods of intellectual and cultural rebirth during our whole period. There was Charlemagne's 9th century Carolingian Renaissance, which saw a rebirth, an interest or rebirth in classical Greek and Roman literature, scientific treatises, language, religious reforms. Then there was the 11th and 12th century Scholastic Renaissance in Western Europe, which saw the rise of the first universities, which also saw an increased interest in Greco-Roman texts, philosophers, scientific texts. And then we have the Italian Renaissance period. So there actually was technically 3 different cultural intellectual rebirths during our whole big period of, roughly 400 to 1500.
So the reason you wrote the book, what got all this started?
Well, to set out much of what I just said, I wanted to show that the period of I wanted to show that the whole idea of the Dark Ages, 1200 years of barbarism and superstition, was just a historical anachronism. So I wrote in the preface of the book that as should become evident, I totally reject the popular notion of the Middle Ages as 1200 years of barbarism and repression, marked by a corrupt Catholic Church that willfully kept the masses ignorant, persecuted women and minorities, and burned a witch or heretic at the stake every alternate Thursday, in which greedy crusaders marched off to Palestine to make their fortune, killing Saracens, came home and then died of the plague without ever having bathed once in their lives. This is more the Middle Ages of a Monty Python sketch, and not the Middle Ages as they were, and all their actual historical and variegated wonder and splendor. And as I go on to say in the preface, basically the Middle Ages were no better or worse, historically speaking, than any other period of history. It just depends on your point of view. I mean, if you think about it, how will historians describe the 20th century, which a lot of our viewers, most of our lives up to now were spent in the 20th century. How will they describe that 800 years from now? As the century of racism, apartheid, the Holocaust, cancer, all these types of terrible things, Watergate, the JFK assassination? Or will they describe the 20th century as the century of scientific progress, the moon landing, the invention of the internet and the personal computer, the invention of TV and movies, the cure for polio, the end of communism, the fall of racism? So it depends on your point of view. So it really depends on how you approach the Middle Ages and how you see it. I mean, every era has good things and bad things. So I wanted to kind of balance out the negative images that a lot of people have in their minds about equating anything medieval with anything barbaric.
Were there other reasons why you wrote the book?
Yeah, I wanted to, and actually the book is basically, people often ask me, why you got all this Renaissance stuff at a medieval, or why do you have all this medieval stuff at a Renaissance fair? And I wanted to help make the distinction between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. That, as we said, the Renaissance broke out near the end of the European Middle Ages. And then I wanted to try to shoot down a lot of the, what I call, myth conceptions that people have about the medieval and Renaissance periods.
Who is your publisher? Did you do it yourself, or did you get someone else to do it for you?
Well, first, let me talk about some of those myth conceptions.
Okay.
Just one or two of those myth conceptions, and then I'll talk about the publisher. One of the big ones that I hear all the time, and I don't know how this even got started, is one that says that medieval people never took baths, that they were dirty, smelly, unwashed barbarians. And that is totally not true. In fact, medieval people, generally speaking, understood the health benefits of bathing and being clean. They understood that they didn't understand germ theory the way we do, but they were smart enough to figure out that, generally speaking, the cleaner you are, the healthier you are, and the better you feel.
Right.
In medieval Europe, pleasant odors were associated with sanctity and holiness, so it was considered a social faux pas to smell bad. I mean, nobody likes to sit on a crowded bus or airplane next to someone who's kind of smelly nowadays. So that was the same way in medieval Europe. In medieval Europe, people, even men, often wore cosmetics. That surprised me when I was doing the research for the book, that even men, for a lot of the medieval period, wore cosmetics because people understood they wanted to look nice and smell nice. So, for example, most manor houses and castles in medieval Europe had large bath chambers. The palace at Westminster in London in the 14th century had indoor hot and cold running water for the king. And I think one of the English kings even had bath mats, so the royal feet wouldn't get cold.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, if you're a king, you can afford that. Another myth conception is the idea that the medieval Roman Catholic Church was opposed to science and learning, and that's another myth conception. Actually, in 1179, the Third Lateran Council of the Church decreed that every cathedral in a city should run a school to teach the children of the townsmen to read and write in Latin. And the Fourth Lateran Council not only mandated that all cathedrals lacking such a school found one, but also ordered every school and every church in Christendom that could to found a school. So the idea that the church was opposed to educating people is just a myth that I wanted to shoot down. And as for science, they didn't call it science in the Middle Ages, they called it natural philosophy. They didn't use the word science till the Victorian period. But medieval people were doing science. They were even doing rudimentary scientific experiments. So that for about 1200 years, the medieval Roman Catholic Church was the primary, if not the sole sponsor of scientific inquiry. And don't forget that it was the medieval Western Church beginning in the late 11th century, that gave us the first universities, where they taught the trivium and the quadrivium, the 7 liberal arts. They taught mathematics, geometry, rhetoric, grammar, philosophy, music, so that by 1200, probably a little bit close to half of the highest offices in the church had degrees in science and mathematics, because they were required in medieval universities. So churchmen got a grounding in basic sciences and basic mathematics. So that was another thing I wanted to sort of set the record straight on, if you will, that the medieval church was opposed to science. And that's a myth that really dies hard, but it's just true. So one of the books I used was Professor James Hannum's The Genesis of Science, how the Christian Middle Ages paved the way for the scientific revolution. And that's the whole genesis of his argument, that the scientific revolution, of Galileo, Copernicus, later Sir Isaac Newton, was made possible by these medieval and Renaissance thinkers, especially medieval thinkers, like St. Thomas Aquinas, Roger Bacon, who experimented with gunpowder, who did rudimentary experiments with optics. His mentor, Bishop Robert Grosseteste, was doing his own, inquiries into various different scientific subjects. The first medical dissections were done in the Middle Ages. The first medical schools were founded. The first hospitals were founded by the medieval church in the Middle Ages. So we owe a lot to the medieval church. So that was another reason I wanted to write the book.
So these are all your sources, or just a few?
Well, these are a handful of the sources that I used. I think there's like 52 or 53 sources at the end of the book that I listed. I could have kept going, but I knew I had to stop at a certain point. So I think we've said that the book is basically a medieval encyclopedia. It defines words and terms, but it also has people, places, events, and there's a footnote for probably 99% of the sources of the entries. There's a footnote leading you to one or more of the sources that I used to write the book. I wanted it to be academically sound. I had to be able to show it to Dr. Dan Burton from UNA, who edited a first draft of the manuscript. And so hopefully, Dr. Burton, if you see this, we got most of the fiddly bits corrected, and I've got an autographed copy for him. And I wanted to be able to send it to my friend Jim Mateer, who his company, Good Cookery, catered our Renaissance feast for 9 years. I had to be able to send him a copy that I wasn't embarrassed about. So I think we finally got all the typos and corrected and misspelled words.
You had mentioned you had to stop at some point. So are we to believe that there's going to be a part 2?
Well, probably won't be a part 2 because my publisher, Alice Cook of Renaissance Valley Publishing, which I got to give a shout out to Alice. She was the one that really encouraged me to do this. This started as I'd give handouts. We do a trivia section of each meeting at the roundtable meetings each month. So I would do these little handouts of A and B medieval Renaissance words. Then in the next month I'd do C, D, and E words, and we eventually go all the way through the alphabet.
Right.
And Alice had kind of put the bug in my ear that maybe I could write these into a book. But really it was Carol Burhans, one of the roundtable board members, who said, you should write this up as a book. You could even do it as a fundraiser. And I thought, well, who will buy it? But I said, okay, I'll give it a shot. So Alice Cook, who runs Renaissance Valley Publishing, said, yeah, you got to do this. And I've had like 5 revisions at this point, so if I don't stop revising it, she's going to shoot me. She edited it with her assistant, Maria Kemp. Billy Warren also edited it, a draft of it. It's also dedicated in honor of him and in memory of several roundtable members that are no longer with us, like Jim Holland, Aubrey Gaskins, Bill and Mickey Parrish and their mom, Joe DeGrucci, Bill Dixon, Jim Holland, some of those, Norman Eller and Leroy, some of those friends of mine and members of the roundtable that have passed away that are no longer with us.
A lot of good people.
Yeah, a lot of great people that I had the honor to serve as volunteers with. So I've done like 5 revisions, and I'm really going to have to stop. But I think I finally got most of the most egregious typos corrected.
5 reprintings total now so far?
Yeah, that's. I think so. It's 4 or 5.
Okay. Now you had mentioned when you was pointing to one of your books, Professor Hammond's, your sources and.
Oh yeah, Hannum was one book I relied on. It was always in the back of my mind, this idea that the medieval church was not opposed to scientific inquiry, that the church never had the idea that we want to keep everybody ignorant and in line. So there may not be any specific references to his book in the footnotes, but that book was always in the back of my mind. I used this book, The Medieval Underworld, as a source. I used Bartlett's England under the Norman and Angevin Kings as a source. I used Ian Mortimer's The Time Traveler's Guide to Medieval England as a source. And again, this is just some of the sources. I wanted it to be historically accurate. So I got to about 52 sources, and I thought, well, okay, that's probably good enough. I'm going to have to stop at some point.
Now, I noticed your T-shirt.
Oh yeah.
So explain that, and then I've got one last question right after that.
Brabantons, 12th and 13th century Flemish mercenaries from the Netherlands. So that's the silhouette of a Brabanton mercenary soldier with his crossbow. So that's a term in the book. So Alice was experimenting with different T-shirt concepts. So this is one we came up with.
And where can we buy your book, Medieval Speake?
Yeah, this is the book. You can get Kindle copies if anybody likes Kindle. I like to actually have a hard copy of a book. The Kindle copies are available on Amazon. You can buy a copy from me. They're $12. I have them at my real job at the library. So if anybody wants to see me at the library and pick one up, they're $12. We're investigating a way that we might be able to sell them through the Alabama Renaissance Faire through our website, but we haven't worked all the details out yet. So right now, you still got to get them from me, but I've got them at the library.
Okay. So
and I'll be glad to autograph it for anybody that wants one. When I'm dead, you can sell it for $12.
That sounds pretty good. Thank you guys for showing up, and we had a really good day. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. Don't forget to subscribe, ring the bell icon, and please, guys, share this to help out the Renaissance Fair. Thank you so much. See you next time. Bye.